Welcome back, Xlice Frongs. Hope you gamers have been enjoying exploring Inazuma. Ayaka is finally here, so it's time for my complete guide. Here's a quick debrief on Ayaka, our newest 5-star character and the first banner of Genshin's 2.0 update. In this guide, we'll be going over 3-star, 4-star, and 5-star weapon options, my personal weapon recommendations in correspondence to artifact recommendations, talents and their priorities, constellations and their breakdowns, attack rotations and playstyles, team compositions, and ending with a showcase. Just like my other guides, Ayaka's guide will likely be a long video, but I will aim to be as information dense as possible to save your time. Everything will be timestamped for your convenience, so feel free to skip around for what you need. Let's begin. Alright, so this is my Ayaka. As a standard for my guide videos, she's kept at level 80, C0, saving for C6 for after the guide's complete, and level 6 talents. If you haven't already seen my summon video, I'd appreciate it if you could check it out after this one. Link will be in the description. If you are new to the channel, this is what I call baseline investment for new characters to showcase for guides. For all these tests, we'll be running 4 Blizzard artifacts set, and because this set grants a maximum of 40 additional crit rate when enemies are frozen, I'll be running crit damage mask for all the tests. Here's a brief glimpse of the artifacts. I'll run through them again in the testing portion. So, 4 weapons like Harbinger of Dawn, which is a 3-star, Black Sword 4-star, and Jade Cutter 5-star, we will potentially overcap the recommended crit rate for these tests, and they won't perform as quote-unquote strongly as you expect. Thus, I've added an additional section to the weapon testing, giving my personal recommendations for weapons depending on the setup. This recommendation section will take into account non-Blizzard set users and potential buffs from teammates to give justice to crit rate weapons that are overshadowed by the 4 Blizzard's broken passive. We'll be testing nearly all the 4-star and 5-star weapons, and also sprinkling in 3-star weapons to showcase her damage in nearly every case. I'll go into specific details shortly. Alright, let's break down talents real quick, beginning with her dash. So, her dash is a cryo replica of Mona's dash, and upon leaving her dash form, applies cryo to nearby enemies and infuses her sword with cryo for 5 seconds. This is the keystone of her cryo kit and extremely easy to apply. You can notice the difference between no infusion and infusion with the color of her auto animations. Golden yellow indicates physical and cyan indicates cryo. There's also a visual indicator on the sword. So, for her A1, or first ascension talent, which I'll refer to as A1. After using her E, Ayaka's normal and charge deal 30% increased damage for 6 seconds. This is a generic synergistic passive incentivizing you to combo her E and then initiate her auto rotation. Now her E is on a 10-second cooldown, which is longer than this buff duration, so there's room for teammate swapping in between. We'll go into playstyles later. Next, her A4, or fourth ascension talent. This revolves around her dash, which is a replica of Mona's dash, but in cryo form. If the end cryo application hits an enemy, Ayaka restores 10 stamina and gains 18% cryo damage for 10 seconds. This incentivizes you to hug enemies to ensure cryo application on them before beginning combos. There's also no cooldown for this passive, so spamming tap dash will continuously apply cryo to enemies, drain and restore your stamina, and perma-infuse her sword with cryo. Now both of these talents are very strong, and they synergize each other very well, because dash canceling is a major part of her kit to maximize rotations. Now for her skill talents, we'll begin with her E because it is her most basic skill and also synergizes with A1. So this is her simplest skill, an AoE cryo damage launch with 10-second cooldown. This activates her A1 and does not need to hit an enemy. You can see her A1 buff as a cryo aura around her. This leads to her normal attack. So, this is roughly half of her playstyle, revolving around her normal and charge attacks, and can be buffed with her E with A1 and can be perma-cryo infused with dash. Her normal charge multipliers here are stronger than Kaching's by almost 20% at the same talent level, which I'm comparing because she's currently the only other self-elemental infusion sword user. With the 30% buff from A1, further increased by about 15 to 20%, her charge attacks also do not have knockback and are also AoE vertically and horizontally around her, which is pretty nice. We'll get more into this in the attack rotation section. And lastly, her Q. This is where more than half of her practical damage output comes from. It launches forward and halts at the first enemy contacted, cutting 19 times and exploding with bloom damage at the end once, for a total of 20 ticks of damage. The AoE of her Q is not too large, so CC or crowd control is preferred to keep enemies in range. Now at level 6, her Q is a total of 3,219% damage in 5 seconds, with a 20-second cooldown. This is comparable to Eula's Q, which is also famous for being a high damage nuke. Eula's Q at level 6 with 14 stacks, which is the higher end if you can manage to get it, deals up to 2,400% damage with a 7-second charge time and the same 20-second cooldown. So, given that this multiplier you can see is insanely high for the short duration, 33% stronger than Eula's Q at the same talent level and C0, playstyles that involve crowd control to maximize and guarantee this damage are recommended. So, given that this is the case, talent leveling priorities are pretty straightforward. I'd recommend Q first, then her normal attack, and then lastly her E. Her highest practical and consistent damage comes from her Q, with additional sub DPS coming from her normal and charge attacks, and the E serving as a proc for her A1 passive and energy recharge for her Q. For people going beyond level 6 talents, I'd say that 868 is a good threshold. Alright, with the talents covered, let's move on to Constellations. In my opinion, her C0 capability is already extremely strong, with her Constellations providing noticeable but not necessary boost to her damage. So, her C1 is an RNG reduction of cooldown for her E, which slightly improves her energy generation rotation. It's based off of her normal charged combos, and if we take a look at her rotation of N4C, avoiding her last auto N5, on average you get 87.5% to proc once from N1, 2, and 3, 87.5% for one proc from N4 because each individual strike is 50%, and 87.5% for one proc from charge, which is also a 3 hit. That's 3 procs for a 0.9 second decrease. So expect a 1 to 2 second cooldown decrease to her E depending on how often you auto. Alright, so her C2 adds 2 additional mini cyclones to her Q, one to the left and one to the right. On large enemies like the Geovishaps, they can all hit the same target and boost Q damage by 20 or 40%. On smaller enemies, this constellation serves more as horizontal reach, providing a larger area to cover more mobs. Then C3. So C3 is plus 3 levels to the Q, which is actually nicer that this is on C3 instead of C5, because levels to the E don't matter as much. You'll see why when I discuss C6s and recommend whales stick to C4. Alright, so C4. This is her strongest general use constellation, which also synergizes with her C2. Anything that her Q hits will decrease the defense by 30% by 6 seconds, which is the entire duration of her Q. This is not to be confused with resistance, like physical or elemental. The previous highest def decreaser we had was Xlice at 23% at C2, and there are other sources like Lisa's Ascension 4 talent, Razor's C4, which is minus 15%. So, for Ayaka at C4, this translates to about a 15% damage increase and doesn't suffer from diminishing returns if you stack minus defense. And then C5 is plus 3 levels to the E, nothing to write home about. And then finally, C6. C6 is, awkwardly enough, more of a flashy constellation with minor overall damage increase and something significantly game-changing for the character. With a 10.5 second cooldown, which is 10 seconds here, and then 0.5 per activation, that only counts down after usage, the 298% charge attack is just an additional multiplier. So at level 6, her charge attack multiplier is about 240%, so this makes her charge multiplier 538% every 10 seconds with C6. This is just over double damage a little bit for her charge attack, correlating with her Q damage every 20 seconds. This procs twice during that period, right? Because her Q is on a 20-second cooldown at most, which is an additional 600% multiplier worth of damage. Compared to her 3,200% Q at level 6, it's only about a 20% damage increase. It might take a little bit to process that breakdown for her C6, but yeah, it's cool and flashy, but less practical than you expect. With all this in mind, this is why I'd recommend C2 and C4 Ayaka as whale thresholds and her strongest constellations, where with C5 and C6, you're not missing out on that much. And that wraps up Constellations. Now, before we jump into attack rotation and testing, I'd like to quickly compare Freeze versus Melt Ayaka with regards to her Q, which is her most practical rotation of consistent damage. For Melt Ayaka, I'd like to point out that her Q does suffer from internal cooldown problems on Melt. This means that only a fraction of her Q ticks will actually proc the Melt reaction, resulting in far lower overall damage than you'd expect. Here's a showcase of what that looks like, bringing in Kazuha, Venti, and Sucrose for their Q to continuously apply Pyro. We can see that with Kazuha and Sucrose, their Pyro application is not frequent enough to justify Melt Ayaka over her Freeze counterpart. Melt procs were limited to about 2 to 3 over the 20 ticks of Q. But with Venti, we can see that Ayaka's Q is able to amount 6 or 7 out of the 20 ticks, which is 1/3 of the hits. This is slightly better thanks to Venti's Q applying Pyro constantly, and a situation where Melt Ayaka is alright, but still a bit of a stretch to recommend over Freeze. And you'll notice in all of these Melt situations, I brought Zhongli in order to petrify the enemies to lock them in for Ayaka's Q. Against larger enemies that can't be vacuumed by a Nemo character as well, this becomes a problem for Melt Ayaka to have free access with her Q damage. So, this leads into the second half, which is Freeze Ayaka is generally what I would recommend, especially with the 4 Blizzard artifact set for the free 40 crit rate. Provides the crowd control for a Q to hit nearly all the cuts and benefits also from double crowd resonance for additional crit rate. Both Mona and Xingqiu work very well here, and Barb is also an option made more viable with Kazuha. Regardless of whether you choose Melt or Freeze Ayaka, having an Anemo character with Viridescent Venerer set generally provides both some form of crowd control as well as resistance shred, to amplify Ayaka's Q damage. Here's one simple demo of Freeze Ayaka with Barbara and Kazuha. I'll leave Mona and Xingqiu for the ending showcase. And I believe that should briefly cover Freeze versus Melt Ayaka. Just wanted to cover the drawbacks of Melt Ayaka and why I recommend Freeze. Alright, let's do a quick talk on attack rotation for Ayaka. So there is a dedicated section on this. This is mostly during the 20-second downtime when her Q isn't up. It is in your best interest to maintain her Q uptime as high as possible because it is her largest and most consistent multiplier and form of damage. Great, let's get into it. So, this is mostly discussing normal charge sequence for her, whether you are main DPS Ayaka with her on the field most of the time, or swap DPS Ayaka focusing on mainly Q and weaving in autos between teammate cooldowns. So, let's begin first with her charge attack. When initiating, hold left click, you will always auto first before the charge attack. And as you can see, there is both start and end lag to her charge attacks. Her charge attack animation ends when she clicks her sword into her sheath. The start lag cannot be cancelled, so this may feel clunky if you're not used to her playstyle. Here's an example of spamming normal to charge without cancelling. You'll see the start and end lag. This end lag, however, can be cancelled, and it is very important to do so. There's 3 ways: jumping, dashing, and swapping teammates. Jumping is viable if no stamina left, dashing if you have stamina and to re-infuse her sword with cryo, and lastly, swapping teammates to use their abilities. Here's an example of each cancel against the Pyro Regisvine, so you can see that the charge attack damage registers. So I personally really enjoy swapping teammates, and it's a very active playstyle that has good rotation on your allies' abilities while also maintaining her flow of playstyle. Now that we've discussed her charge attack canceling, let's move on to the 2 rotations that I recommend. So first is DN4C. What this means is you dash, and then you do 4 of your autos, and then you do a charge attack. Dash to infuse, N1, N2, N3, N4, cancel into charge, and cancel to repeat. Now, avoiding the N5 is in your best interest because N4 to N5 is the longest delay. This sequence consumes about 3 seconds of field time. Now, the other is a faster and more swap DPS oriented dash N1C, or DN1C short. Dash to infuse, N1 into charge attack, and cancel to repeat. Now this sequence consumes about 1.5 to 1.7 seconds of field time. Now let me be clear though, don't let this limit your playstyle. Anything in between N1 to N4 into charge cancel is perfectly fine. No matter which you use, she can get very stamina hungry, even if her dash gives her a little bit back, so be mindful of that. Practice what you're comfortable with and remember to try and maintain your Q uptime, which is why I prefer swap DPS DN1C to utilize my teammates' abilities and weapon passives like Favonius if available. Her Q is super important, and in the swap DPS playstyle, it is over 50% of her practical damage output. Lastly, before we jump into how testing will work, I want to demonstrate her charge attack's AoE capability. Like I mentioned when describing her talents, her charge attacks also do not have knockback and are also AoE vertically and horizontally around her, which is pretty nice. You can envision the AoE of her charge attack as a sphere around her as it hits enemies in front, slightly behind, slightly above, and below. Alright, now that we've gone over the basics of Ayaka, let's do a quick debrief on how testing will work with Ayaka. You can see here, my roster of 19 level 80 or higher swords. I will not be testing 2 of them. Firstly, the Prototype Ranker, which is the physical damage based craftable, and the Freedom Sworn, the 5-star on rate up during Kazuha. The other 17 we will take a look at. Ranker is directly inferior to the Kageuchi, the new Inazuma craftable, which I've gone over in a previous video and provided the quest in the pinned comment. The Freedom Sworn is an EM support-based weapon intended for Kazuha. If you don't have Kazuha but have this sword, I'd still recommend some of the 4-star weapons over it. So, for testing, we will start with the 3-star weapons, Phillip Blade as an attack percent baseline, and then Harbinger of Dawn, due to its insanely high crit rate and crit damage stats, and if running Freeze maintaining 90% HP or above is achievable. Then we will move on to the 4-star weapons. I'm going to start with the baseline with the new Kageuchi sword. Then we'll take a look at Iron Sting and Alley Flash as the EM weapons, then Favonius, Sacrificial, and Festering for the recharge, then Flute and Lion's Roar for generic attack percent, and then finally Black Sword and Black Lift for crit rate crit damage. So Lion's Roar is kind of extra here, but it has the exact same base attack and attack percent secondary as the Flute, so it's fine to include. And then finally for the 5-star weapons, Skyward Blade, Aquila Favonia, Jade Cutter, Summit Shaper, and the new Mist Splitter in no particular order. The 5-star weapons are all pretty different in what they provide, so we'll see how they do. Now, as for artifacts, we'll be running 4 Blizzard with these artifacts. With these pieces, I'm looking at 50% crit rate and 206 crit damage and 116.8 recharge. Recharge is lower than I like, but the Blizzard dungeon hasn't been nice to me. All tests will be run with a crit damage mask, since 4 Blizzard provides up to a 40% crit rate buff if the enemies are frozen. For Harbinger of Dawn, Black Sword, and Jade Cutter, I'll be switching out my cryo damage cup from this one to a pure crit damage one that will be overcapping crit rate. You will notice that they still fall behind slightly because crit rate is less valuable given that this artifact set provides most of it. I will discuss this difference post-test. And finally, please remember, for some of these tests, I will be using crit rate food to boost my crit rate and make testing easier for myself. This does not affect the damage output we'll be comparing, since I compare all crit numbers, and I'll make note of how much crit rate each weapon has as a base. They should be relatively maintained equally. With that out of the way, let's begin testing, and for that, let's head over to the Pyro Regis file. Okay, let's begin with testing. First up, the 3-star weapons, beginning with the Fillet Blade. This is our generic attack percent weapon. Alright, that's the Fillet Blade. Let's move on to the Harbinger. I'm going to be switching up my cup to a different cryo damage cup due to the overcap crit. Cool, so that's both the 3-star options, and with 4 Blizzard, we can see that Harbinger is only minimally stronger than Fillet Blade because of my lack of attack percent. This is a common theme with 4 Blizzard users, who are able to stack massive amounts of crit damage but lack attack percent. In general cases, if you're running a 3-star weapon, that likely means you may not have access to 4-star craftable options like the Inazuma one yet, or you may not have access to 4 Blizzard. So I'd say it's fine to use either one, with Harbinger being the strongest with an HP requirement until you can craft. I'll discuss more after all the tests. Alright, next up, 4-star weapons. Let's begin with the new craftable, the Kageuchi. With this weapon, it's difficult to test the value of the passive, so I'll keep it in mind for later. So with 4 Blizzard on my Ayaka, Kageuchi squeezes out 16.7k with N1 to N4, 12.2k with charged, and 14.7k with E. Her Q managed to smack a total of 141k damage. These will be baseline numbers for Blizzard. For the rest of the weapons, I'm going to hold off my thoughts until the end. Now time for the 2 EM weapons, beginning first with the Iron Sting with passive activated. Now let's take a look at the Alley Flash, also with the passive activated. Okay, the EM weapons are done. Now let's move on to the ER weapons, which sacrifice raw damage for much higher Q uptime, which is important for Ayaka. Though the damage numbers are going to be lower, that doesn't necessarily mean a weaker build. These builds will be able to span their Q much more effectively by sacrificing damage. First, Favonius and Sacrificial, and the numbers are identical between these two because they share the same base stats, so we're only going to show one. Alright, so next, Festering Desire. So this one's a little bit more unique, and the passive is kind of wasted because her E isn't a large source of damage. And also keep in mind that I have this weapon at level 90, so it is going to be quote-unquote a little bit stronger than what it should be in comparison to the other level 80 weapons. Alright, now that we're finished with ER weapons, now we're going to move on to the attack percent weapons, Flute and Lion's Roar. I'm only going to be showcasing one. That's because they both share identical stats. You can see that the Flute and the Lion's Roar both share the base attack and the attack percent the same. Lion's Roar passive will not be activated for this. Alright, so the attack percent weapons are done. Finally, the crit rate, crit damage weapons. We're going to begin with the Black Sword. And now we're going to switch the cup back to a pure crit damage one because we're overcapping on crit rate again. And finally, let's finish off with the Black Lift. We're going to be doing 0 stacks, and also we're going to be switching back the cup to this one. So, that's all the 4-star options. You can see from the damage charts that the attack percent weapons are all stronger with the 4 Blizzard set. The Kageuchi's passive would provide a bit more recharge than the other attack percent weapons. Blackcliff is right behind, and with 1 passive stack will overtake in terms of damage, but it still lacks the energy refund in comparison to the Kageuchi. Alley Flash's unique passive takes the cake, but that requires no damage to be taken. Black Sword falls behind because crit rate overcap makes it hard to build around, and the ER weapons are the weakest but provide the best cycling of the Q, increasing recharge to upwards of 160 to 170%. I'll touch more on my recommendations later. Okay, so with the 4-star weapons done, let's take a peek at the 5-star weapons. I will save my discussion for after the tests. First off, Skyward Blade. Increase in recharge with a passive beneficial to normal charge post Q. Passive is not tested because auto plus E are standalone for my tests. Okay, so next, Aquila Favonia. This is one of my level 90s weapons, so the damage is going to be about 10% higher than expected. Alright, that's Aquila. Next up, Jade Cutter. And with the Jade Cutter, I'll be swapping the cut for the pure crit damage one again. But even with this swap, I'm still incredibly overcapped on crit rate for a Blizzard build, so take that into account. You can see that my crit rate is 83.7%, and if enemies are frozen with 4 Blizzard, I'd be getting 40 crit, so I'm already overcapping a tremendous amount. Alright, so that was Jade Cutter. Let's move on to Summit Shaper. So with the Summit Shaper, I'll be testing with max stacks but no shield. This is the highest raw attack stat stick that we have. So for 4 Blizzard, where we lack attack percent, it will perform pretty well. With the Summit Shaper, I'll be switching back to the other cry damage cup. And finally, the newest 5-star Mist Splitter. So for the Mist Splitter, I'll be testing 1 stack for normal, charged, and E, and then 3 stacks for the Q. I cannot avoid 2 of the stacks when pressing Q because that's how the weapon works. Okay, so those are the 5-star weapons. We can see that Skyward Blade's general damage is slightly lower than the DPS 4-star weapons, but has much more recharge. Aquila at level 90 is still not quite at the stage of level 80 Mist Splitter or Summit Shaper with stacks, but it's still a very solid stat stick as it has 48 base attack and a minimum 20% attack from the passive. Mine's R2, so it's 25%. Now Jade Cutter, as expected, suffers from overcrit very hard and is difficult to build around for 4 Blizzard. Without 4 Blizzard though, this weapon is top notch as the crit rate it provides it becomes extremely valuable. Summit Shaper's attack buffs send it right below Mist Splitter and are nearly equal on the normal charge attack damage. And then Mist Splitter's 3-stack damage on Q is extremely high and unmatched, with normal charge still providing a very high threshold of damage. I'll discuss more in my weapon recommendations, but that should wrap up the tests. Okay, now that testing is complete, before we get into my personal weapon recommendations, I need to discuss artifact recommendations because weapons are dependent on artifacts. So, 4 Blizzard set is the most common option, especially when running Freeze Ayaka. Even if the subsets aren't the best for the set, you can still make do nearly all the time with a crit damage mask because the passive provides up to 40% crit rate boost, which is basically a free Jade Cutter in terms of crit rate. It's massive. Now, besides 4 Blizzard, 4 Emblem set for Q rotation spam is also a solid option, especially with Inazuma out now, lots of resonance headed there. While you're working towards those 4 sets though, there's a lot of viable 2-piece combos that work quite well. Any mix and match of these are good stepping stones prior to reaching a 4 solid set. We have 2-piece, Blizzard, Gladiator, Noblesse, Reminiscence, and Emblem. That's the 2-piece set, not the 4-piece set. While you're running 2-piece, it is important to maximize substats like crit rate, crit damage, and ER instead of forcing set bonus. If not running 4-piece Blizzard or Emblem, it's okay to run a Rainbow, no set, but with good substats. And finally, if I remember this correctly, for newer players who may not have access to this yet, like pre-AR45 or something, don't be afraid to run 4-star pieces from Braveheart set or Gladiator set and the Berserker set until reaching AR45. Alright, Alright, now let's dive into main stat pieces for the Sands, Goblet, and Mask. For the Sands, prioritize attack percent for both Blizzard and Emblem set. ER on the main stat for Sands is not terrible, but you may severely lack attack percent running this. Better to save the energy recharge for substats. Now for the Cup, prioritize cryo damage, or if you don't have a decent cryo cup yet, attack percent is usable. And finally, the Mask. If Blizzard set, always crit damage because 4-piece immediately bumps your potential crit rate base to 45, which requires less substat crit rate rolls to hit a good threshold. If you're not running 4 Blizzard set, in the case of 4 Emblem or any of the 2-piece mix and match, then crit rate or crit damage depending on your other crit rate sources from the substats or the weapon. Most of the time, if you're running non-4 Blizzard though, then crit rate will be much more valuable than crit damage. Depends on your ratio. And that should be artifacts and main stats in a nutshell. So now that testing is complete, artifact recommendations are set, I can finally talk about my personal weapon recommendations. For my 4 Blizzard Freeze Ayaka gamers, avoid crit rate weapons like Black Sword, Harbinger of Dawn, and Jade Cutter because you're very likely to overcap on crit rate and waste stats. Now for the 5-star weapons, Mist Splitter number 1, then Summit Shaper if you have it. Aquila is a fine stat stick despite the physical damage percent secondary because it provides 20% attack and has high base attack. Skyward Blade is really a last resort weapon, and even then I recommend some 4 stars over it. Now for the 4-star weapons, Aminoma is universally strong for Blizzard set, provides attack percent that the Blizzard set usually lacks due to high crit damage builds, and 2-stack refunds flat 12 energy. This does not scale with ER, that's confirmed. So essentially, perfect play means 68 energy Q for Ayaka. Flute and Lion's Roar are general attack percent stat sticks. Pretend that their passives don't exist for her. Blacklift for groups of enemies to help scale its passive, but it's worse against singular bosses. It's a pure damage, but no help to recharge. Favonius, if recharge weapon is the choice, it sacrifices damage, but Q uptime is almost doubled and assists team utility. And for Ayaka, her Q is very important. For other Blizzard weapons, follow the test results. And for my non-Blizzard Ayaka gamers, i.e. for Emblem or Mix or in progress builds, 5-star weapons, Mist Splitter is still the number 1, then Jade Cutter and then Summit Shaper. Aquila is fine, avoid Skyward. For 4-star weapons, Aminoma is still very good just because of the passive energy that essentially makes the Q cheaper, but now a little bit more reliant on good crit rate, crit damage gear. Black Sword is now much stronger and helps build easier, since crit rate is a lot more valuable without 4 Blizzard. Blackcliff is less valuable, only preferable for groups of enemies. Flute Lions are even worse due to heavier substat requirements. They don't have Aminoma's energy passive. Favonius is still a solid recharge choice, much higher Q uptime makes up for lack of stats. Now, with all that context in place, let's go over the summary of these details to help you guys digest this information. But please go over the previous information so that the next information makes more sense because context really matters here. 5-star Mist Splitter in every single case. 4-star Aminoma is universally good, scales very well with refinements, shines with 4 Blizzard. 4-star Blackcliff, strong but situational on passive stacks. Harbinger, Jade Cutter, Black Sword, much better in a non-4 Blizzard setting, where crit rate is more valuable. And then Favonius is a solid universal ER weapon. And those are my personal weapon recommendations. Hopefully this helps condense all the other information regarding weapons. Okay, let's jump into team composition discussion. 2 most important things to consider when building a team around Ayaka. We need to assist her 80 energy Q cost, and we need consistent crowd control to maximize her Q damage. Extra points for adding an Anemo character with Viridescent Venerer Shred. Alright, even though I don't recommend it, here's an okay composition for Melt Ayaka. So Ayaka, Bennett Venti, right? And then the 4th slot here can be either Xiangling or Zhongli for the hard CC, especially against the Geofish Eps. Only consider this if you have Venti. It's much worse without him if you're replacing him with like Sucrose or Kazuha, because Venti's power application for absorbing and applying is much faster. Alright, now onto Freeze Ayaka and general units that are viable. Mona, Xingqiu, and Tartag are all solid Hydro enablers. Barbara is also an option, but I'd only consider this freeze comp with the Kazuha duo as well. Cryo batteries like Diona, Rosaria, Changyun, Heya, all viable. Highly recommend Favonius on all these cryo batteries. Sacrificial is also an option for Changyun and Diona. No need to stack crit on transfer Rosaria because Ayaka most likely will already have enough with 4 Blizzard here. I don't recommend Chi-Chi because she generates very limited energy for the team, especially given how hungry Ayaka's Q is for energy. So, for our Anemo Viridescent Venerer Res Shredders, EM Kazuha is excellent to buff Ayaka, more valuable than sub-DPS Kazuha here. Venti, Sucrose are with Viridescent, both viable. Venti can refund energy to Ayaka if his Q absorbs Cryo. Sucrose does not need to transfer EM, so Favonius may be a better option for more recharge. Venti can refund 50 energy to Ayaka if his Q absorbs Cryo. Sucrose does not need to transfer EM, so Favonius may be a better option for more recharge. Anemo, MC, and Jean have less synergy, but are still okay options. Alright, cool. That should wrap up most of the team compositions. Okay, let's showcase some comps. We'll go to Abyss 12-1 as our playground, and Ayaka will be using the new R180 Inazuma Craftable, Aminoma, Kageushi for all the showcases. Cue the music, Mr. Cope. And with the showcase complete, that about wraps up the core of this guide. This last section I've left to answer some frequently asked questions, but before I do that, if this guide helped you understand Ayaka a little bit better, consider liking the video and subscribing to the YouTube channel for more similar content. It's free and I'd really appreciate it, and we're almost at 100,000 subs. I also stream Genshin nearly every day at twitch.tv/Xlice. So if you happen to watch Twitch, consider dropping a follow. Much love, gamers. Okay, some common questions about Ayaka. Question 1. Ganyu versus Ayaka. My answer. This comes down to playstyle preference mostly. Melt Ganyu is stronger than Melt Ayaka because Ganyu's Frostfang Bloom can double reverse melt. Melt Ayaka suffers heavily from internal cooldown that we showcased in the video. Freeze Ganyu's AoE coverage is larger, but Freeze Ayaka's damage potential is larger. In the right conditions, both can shine. So it really comes down to playstyle. Next question. Are constellations necessary? Short answer, not really. For Ayaka, I think her strength at C0 is solid already. Since she's mainly focused on her Q damage and uptime, the main constellations that affect this are C2 and C4. Playstyle doesn't change with increasing constellations like some characters. For you whales out there, C4 is uniquely strong due to the large minus 30% defense shred, but whether it's worth the price is up to you. Next question. Amenoma, Kageuchi, or the Blackcliff Longsword? It's a very popular one. My answer. I prefer Amenoma in most situations, especially on higher refinement. Flat energy return works well with Ayaka's kit, and if you're running 4 Blizzard, you'll already be stacked on crit damage with the mask. However, if you already have Blackcliff at a high refine, and you can maintain 1 or 2 stacks of attack percent all the time, then it's a solid choice. Next question. How about an ER timepiece to have better Q rotation? It's an alright choice, but if you want more ER, I'd rather you stick with an attack percent timepiece and change your weapon to, like, for example, Favonius for the energy recharge. Reason being is that Favonius' passive grants even more orbs on top of the base ER stat, so it's more efficient than just having straight up ER on the timepiece. And final question, freeze or melt Ayaka? I prefer freeze due to 4 Blizzard set granting so much crit rate and free crowd control to keep enemies locked for her Q. And that about sums things up. If you managed to watch this entire video, you are a massive Giga Chat. Thank you so much. Hopefully this video was more concise with presenting information. I want it to be info dense and to the point to save you time. I wish that everyone's still trying to pull for Ayaka the best of luck, and with a final reminder to consider liking and subscribing to the YouTube channel. I really appreciate it. And with that, Mr. Xlice signing off. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one. Take care.